Hello. So I have a little topic I've been thinking about recently because I'm coming to read this book by Schopenhauer, The Two Fundamental Problems of Ethics, and I kind of want to reflect on it. But before going into it, I kind of thought like this question of is studying ethics or like reading ethics useless? Like what's the point of it? And there are two kind of argumentations that I see for the reasons as to why ethics is useless. The one kind of comes from skepticism, which is where I usually stand on things, and that's uh, let's say you have like a moral realist and a anti-realist who one says we shouldn't do murder because it's evil, and the other says we shouldn't do murder because it's just not preferable. To me, what matters in that case is that they're both avoiding the behavior that is unpreferable. Whether you want to call it evil or not, it doesn't really matter to me because, according to skeptics, not that skeptics commit this claim, but it's just that skeptics have failed to come across somebody who can justify their worldview. So it's not saying that like the moral realist and the anti-realist can't justify their worldviews. It's just that if you subject them to skepticism, they probably won't be able to justify their worldviews. And so rather than debating on whether something is good or bad, let's just look at the actions inside reality and look for ones that seem to be preferable towards us, right? You could say like in the same way that when I touch a hot stove, I seem to have a negative reaction. Well, in the same way when like I allow theft to happen, I seem to have a negative reaction. And that seems to be spontaneous. It's not like inferred. It just happens. In the same way that like the perception of the color red just happens. You don't infer the color red. It seems to just happen. So from a skeptical point of view, I could see why somebody might say ethics is useless to study. And that is kind of actually, that's a very persuasive worldview. And I could see if you use that against studying ethics, right? If you come to the conclusion that you shouldn't study ethics, I could see why if you use that worldview. Another worldview, which I think is kind of useless because it kind of falls in on itself and when you compare it to the skeptical worldview, is the anti-realist worldview. So like they might say, nobody can really come up with notions of good or bad and why we shouldn't do something without making an ought statement or some kind of normative statement, some kind of you should be doing this because my feelings, basically. And then you're going to ask, well, why are your feelings good standards of anything? Of course, you would probably say they aren't. This is kind of what the anti-realists mean. Or you could say there's like a more naturalistic notion of anti-realism where it's the categories of good and bad aren't filled with anything meaningful. They're kind of like empty. So like when I say, for example, gravity, when I use this word, I can like refer to something tangible and measurable. But when I refer to like good or bad, it's not really measurable. It's not really tangible. And so they might therefore say that we can get rid of the notions of good or bad. They're just normative frameworks. And ultimately it boils down to preferences. And so for the anti-realist and for both the skeptic, ethics is kind of more like debating about like labels, which they might find useless, like debating on whether we should call something good or bad. Or it's debating about like the reasons for something, like we shouldn't do X, Y, and Z because reasons H, W, Y, right? And they might find that a little bit useless. Or maybe they just think that it's a futile enterprise in general, and so it's right not worthwhile pursuing. I could see all these arguments, and I kind of think most people will fall into the anti-realist camp on this topic. Especially people who read nonfiction, they tend to fall into either anti-realism or moral realism. But I think for the most part, anti-realism. I could be wrong about that, but I, however, disagree with both topics because I think, or say both schools of thought, because I think you can get better at the kind of reasoning involved that comes from moral reflection, or like reflecting on ethics, or the substance of ethics, right? I think most readily of judges, specifically judges who are ruling on very nuanced cases. I remember there was a case where a mother had received information about her 14-year-old son over-consuming alcohol, and it was at the stepfather's house. And the mother knew, and so she just put him in a cold bath. But at the same time, it happened in the stepfather's house, and there was issues about responsibility there. I think reasoning about how responsibility should be distributed amongst humans in a way that doesn't result in widespread backlash or outrage is a skill that you can get better at over time. In the same way that when you're, say, solving a chess puzzle, you get better at seeing the nuances on the board and you can solve more difficult chess puzzles. I think in the situation of ethics, the rules of the game are human nature, right? As much as you want to say that intellectual categories like good and bad are blank, human behavior there is a nature to it, right? There is a constant, right? We all speak a language, whether it's Mandarin or English. We all have a grammar to our languages. We all have family structures. We all have cultures. And those cultures tend to have leaders and submissive roles, things like this. There tends to be universals across every instance of humans. And so you can come up, those would be your rule sets. And so you could come up with ways of distributing responsibility to people in situations where, say, the situations violate the cultural norms of your society, which are even then a set of rules just because they're cultural norms. Right? If you try and violate cultural norms, you'll find very quickly that you're not going to be able to maintain your level of freedom, depending on the cultural norm you violate. But laws, for example, are cultural norms. And if you go around stealing from people, you're going to find yourself imprisoned pretty quickly, which is probably a state of an outcome that you don't want. And so even cultural norms are rules, and human nature is rules. And so there's going to be rules that you want to use in your favor when you're distributing responsibility when it comes to bad situations. And I think that's something you can get better at. And I think one of the best ways to get better at that is reading ethics. I think meta-ethics can be useless for this topic, reasoning about whether morality is cognitive or non-cognitive, right? Whether it is true or false. I think we could ignore that kind of reading about ethics, but the kind of ethics you find, let's say, in the reasoning used by judges in case law, or practical ethics, right? When you're talking about trolley problems, this is a lot more useful, and that's the kind of skill, or that's the kind of substance or topic where you can get better at the skill of distributing responsibility. So I would conclude that it's not useless. Meta-ethics, in the purest sense of metaphysics, that's probably useless. But applied ethics, or dealing with matters of ethics inside society, that's not useless, and that's a skill that you can actually get better at. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, because I think the anti-realists will probably disagree with both stances. They're going to say it's preferences all the way down. But with that being said, guys, let me know what you think. Bye-bye for now.